The cardiology department of the hospital in Berlin was bathed in bright but cold and oppressive light. On the screen of the ultrasound machine, abnormal waves were displayed, rising and falling like the flame of an oil lamp on the verge of extinguishing. The German doctor gently placed the thick folder containing the medical history on the table, his voice strict but full of sympathy. "Hans, your heart is no longer able to pump blood to support your body. You have a few weeks left." Hans Müller froze in his chair. At 68 years old, he, a former German veteran, had seen many bombardments and battles during his service abroad. He had survived conflict, survived years of exhausting work in the factory, thinking he still had enough time to live a quiet old age. But now the death sentence had been passed on him, and not by a bullet or a shell, but by his own heart, rotting in his chest. He looked at his calloused hands, which had once trembled while clutching a rifle on the battlefield. Now these hands were only strong enough to hold the doctor's conclusion. His eyes clouded over, and in that moment, he heard the roar of helicopters from times of war, smelled the scent of gunpowder, and heard the heartbreaking cries of children he had once seen. The waiting list for a heart transplant in Germany and the Eurotransplant zone was not less than 2 years. The doctor paused, then lowered his voice. "Honestly, you cannot wait that long." These words were like the strike of a knife. Hans took a deep breath, but sharp pain pierced his chest, his heart beating chaotically with interruptions. Through the pain, he thought of only one thing. He would die, without ever returning to the places where so many ghosts remained, without ever asking for forgiveness. That evening, in his cramped apartment, Hans opened his laptop. He typed feverishly, searching for any information on heart transplants around the world. Hundreds of results appeared, mostly about India, Thailand, Singapore, but his gaze suddenly stopped on the phrase, "Successful heart transplantation in Canada has saved many critical patients." He was stunned. Canada. This name hit his memory like a hammer. In Hans's head, images of snow-covered valleys, vast forests, and the stories of peacekeeping missions rushed by. He thought he would never go there, because the sheer distance made his heart clench with pain. It cannot be. "Canada?" Hans muttered. But then he continued to read international medical reports, interviews on television about cases of heart transplants performed by a team of Canadian doctors. It was not fiction. A tiny ray of light dawned. He called his old friend Fritz, also a veteran, with whom they had served together years ago. On the other end of the wire, Fritz was silent for a long time, and then slowly said, "Hans, I read about this. Medicine in Canada is world-class. If you want a real chance, perhaps this is the only place." The phone fell from his hands. Hans lowered his head, tears clouding his eyes. But in this darkness, he saw the image of a small wooden cross stuck by the road in a distant conflict zone where he had once left a bouquet of wildflowers for a nameless child. For the first time in many years, his old heart beat faster, but not from illness, but from a fragile hope that had just flared up. He whispered to himself, "If I have a last chance, I must go there. I will go to Canada." From this moment, his journey between life and death began. An old suitcase stood in the middle of the living room. Hans sat motionless, looking at it as a witness to the journey ahead. He understood perfectly well that this was not just a trip in search of life, but also a meeting with destiny. In his head, fragments of memories from his service suddenly came to life. Nights wrapped in smoke and fire, the whistle of shells in the sky, comrades falling nearby. He still remembered the eyes of a woman in a war-torn village who, clutching a small child to herself, looked at the squad of soldiers with boundless despair. This look had not been erased over decades, as if carved by a knife into his memory. Hans breathed heavily, pain squeezing his chest. He put his hand on his chest, feeling the intermittent beats of his heart, each of which sounded like a funeral bell. He understood that his time was running out. In this moment of weakness, he remembered his younger son, who often called and asked, "Dad, when will you tell me everything about the war?" Hans never dared to answer. These memories were too heavy, and he feared that if he told, his son would see in him a father who had witnessed sins. But now, when death was so close, Hans had no choice. He needed to go. Whether for salvation or to utter a belated apology to the world, he had to step on that land. Night fell. He opened an old notebook and hastily wrote a few lines for his family. "If I do not survive, remember that I left, with hope. And if possible, let my ashes remain where I owe a debt to blood and memory." Outside, the reflections of streetlights fell on the window pane. Hans closed his eyes under the weak beats of his heart. It seemed to him he heard the distant ringing of church bells. This ringing mixed with his rapid breathing, simultaneously reminding him of death and urging him to live one more time. Tomorrow he would buy a ticket, and this time nothing would stop him. That morning, Berlin shone in the sun. Hans rolled his old suitcase out the door. Every step was heavy, as if he carried the weight of his entire life. The heart in his chest pounded with rough, uneven beats, simultaneously urging him on and warning him. He knew that if he did not leave today, there might not be another chance. On the way to the airport, Hans looked out the car window at the modern buildings gleaming under the sun. Rushing crowds, honking cars. All this seemed to be happening in another world, a world he was about to leave. He whispered, "This time I am going to live, but perhaps this is my last trip." A special medical flight ticket, arranged through a humanitarian connection, was already waiting for him. The path ahead was long, more than a day, with connections in London and Montreal before landing in Toronto. Every stage was a test because his heart could stop at any moment. At security control, the airport officer looked at Hans's passport, his gaze lingering longer when he saw the veteran status in his file. The officer asked nothing, simply returned the documents, but a lump rose in Hans's soul. The past he so wanted to forget was imprinted on every page. The plane tore away from the earth, piercing white clouds. Hans sat by the window, clutching the armrest tightly. The slightest vibration of the engine echoed with pain in his chest. The nurse accompanying him gave him a small pill, her voice soft. "Do not worry. We are constantly monitoring your condition." Hans nodded weakly, but deep down he understood that nothing was certain except the fragility of his own life. After several hours, the plane landed in London for a transfer. The city sprawled below with thousands of lights, like a starry sky. But Hans had no strength to admire it. In the medical waiting area, he had an attack of angina, his heart beating chaotically, sweat pouring like hail. British doctors quickly examined him and allowed him to fly further, only with the condition of constant monitoring. One of the medics quietly said, "You will be able to continue the journey only if you truly believe that you will reach the destination." The next flight to Montreal was even harder. The air in the cabin was dry and cold. Breathing became increasingly difficult. He took a small notebook from his pocket and reread the lines written last night. The words, "If I do not return," blurred in his moist eyes. He suddenly thought that perhaps his ashes would not reach Canada, but would remain somewhere high in the sky. This thought made him shudder, but immediately after that, he again heard the ringing of bells in his memory. The ringing of an old chapel, somewhere in his past. That evening, he stood motionless, the rifle in his hands trembling. That bell ringing reminded him of home across the ocean. Now this ringing sounded again, like a guiding thread. The plane landed in Montreal on a rainy night. Outside the window, airport lights reflected in long strips on the wet asphalt. Hans had almost no strength left. He lived only thanks to support injections and the hands of nurses who were nearby. But a strange determination shone in his eyes. He knew that ahead was the last leg. Montreal. Toronto. If he overcame it, he would step on the land he had simultaneously feared and yearned to see. The last plane took off. Outside was impenetrable night. lightning flashing in the sky. In the cabin, Hans closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. "Give me one more chance. If I am destined to die, let me die in Canada, there, where this heart will be saved, or find peace." The plane flew through the darkness, carrying the old soldier and his worn-out heart to where both the past and the future awaited him. At 4 in the morning, the plane landed at Toronto Pearson Airport. The sky over Toronto was still dark, low clouds and damp fog settling on the portholes. When the cabin door opened, a stream of cool air burst in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and distant pine. Hans froze. It had been a lifetime since he had breathed such sharp, fresh air of a country that was known for peace. The stretcher was wheeled out of the cabin. Hans lay motionless, his eyes wide open, watching the yellow lights illuminating the wet tarmac. At the ramp of the plane, a Canadian medical team was already waiting. A nurse quickly gave a sign. The doctor's hands worked smoothly, like a well-oiled mechanism. A female voice rang out, low but confident. "We are from the Peter Munk Cardiac Center, requesting immediate transfer of the patient." Hans tried to turn his head. He managed to see only dark, bright eyes under a medical mask. The gaze was calm, but full of determination. The woman approached, adjusted his oxygen tube, her voice brief and clear. It was Dr. Emily Richardson, who would be responsible for the heart transplant operation on which he had bet his entire life. At that moment, Hans's heart clenched with pain. He remembered the faces of people in war zones he had seen, exhausted, with heavy burdens on their shoulders, with eyes full of fear. But the gaze of Dr. Emily today was completely different, calm, bright, and filled with immense responsibility. The ambulance sped through the morning fog. Outside the window, Toronto was waking up. Rows of trees along the highway flashed by, a few cyclists braving the morning chill, early risers quietly setting up their day. All this looked like a film running in reverse. The battlefield, once turned into ruins in his memory, had now become a living and peaceful city. Hans lay on the stretcher, listening to the howl of the ambulance siren. This sound was exactly like the siren of a military hospital he had heard in his youth. The difference was only that this time it sounded to save his life, not to carry away bodies of soldiers. A mixed feeling of terror and tenderness rose to his throat, forcing him to close his eyes. Tears rolled from the corners of his eyes. In the receiving department of the hospital, Dr. Emily quickly reviewed his documents. Beside her stood Dr. Michael, responsible for anesthesia, and David, the transplant coordinator. Emily said shortly, "Terminal stage heart failure, immediate circulatory support required. Preparing for the option of temporary artificial heart installation pending a donor." Hans vaguely heard a few words, making out only donor and heart. He tried to open his mouth, his voice trembling. "Please, do not give up." Dr. Emily leaned down, her determined gaze meeting his. "We never give up when it comes to human life. You will have a chance." These words were an anchor that held Hans amidst the waves of despair. For the first time since he left Germany, he felt he was not alone. Outside the window, the dawn light of Toronto began to break through. Weak rays of sun illuminated the green tops of maple trees, reflecting on the tiles of the hospital courtyard. Hans looked at this scene and whispered to himself, "Here I will live or die. But whatever happens, I have arrived." In a small meeting room next to the ICU, screens continuously displayed Hans's vital signs. His pulse raced, then fell to dangerous values. Every broken line on the monitor was like a knife blade at his throat. Dr. Emily stood straight, her voice low. "He cannot wait long. If a donor does not appear in the next few days, we will have to install a temporary artificial heart. But with his age and health condition, the risks are very high." Silence reigned in the room. No one said a word, but everyone understood that chances were melting with every hour. At that moment, Coordinator David's radio hissed. David turned it on, listening tensely to every word. His face suddenly changed. His eyes lit up. He almost shouted, "Severe trauma in Vancouver. A 23-year-old guy was in a car accident. Brain death confirmed. The family is considering heart donation." The whole room seemed to wake up. All eyes turned to Dr. Emily. She only nodded briefly, her voice firm. "Get ready. If the family agrees, we need to immediately send a team for the organ." The distance from Vancouver to Toronto is not small, and every minute was worth its weight in gold. Hans lay on the hospital bed, fragments of conversations reaching him through the open door. He did not understand everything, but made out one word: heart. He quietly squeezed the edge of the blanket and whispered, "A heart that can save me." Meanwhile, in a hospital in Vancouver, the guy's family sat. His mother, a thin woman with disheveled hair from a sleepless night, squeezed the edge of her clothes with calloused hands. Before her, doctors explained everything in detail. Her son would not wake up, but if she agreed to heart donation, he could save another life. The mother was silent for a long time. Outside the window in Vancouver, dawn was breaking over the mountains. Rays of sun broke through the foliage, illuminating her exhausted face. Finally, she quietly said, "He was a kind boy. He always said that one must live to help others. If he is leaving, let his heart continue to beat for someone else." This decision was like a fire lit in the darkness. The message was immediately sent to Toronto. In the cardiac center, David almost burst into the office with the news. The family agreed. Young, healthy heart, matching blood type. We have a chance. Hans did not hear all the words, but saw how Dr. Emily turned around, and a completely different light appeared in her eyes. She approached him and slowly, clearly, so that he understood, said, "A heart has been found for you, but we face a race against time. Hold on." Hans closed his eyes, trembling, tears rolling down his cheeks. He whispered, "A Canadian heart will beat in me." Outside, an ambulance siren wailed. A special team was preparing to fly from Toronto to Vancouver to pick up the container that held life. All of Toronto froze in anticipation, and in the quiet ward, the former German veteran lay motionless, listening to the weak beats of his heart, while another heart was already on its way, carrying with it the last hope. In the operating room in Vancouver, a white cooling container was already prepared. Doctors stood with serious faces, as if preparing for a sacred ritual. When the clock hands indicated the exact time of repeated confirmation of brain death, the young man's heart was extracted. It was still pink, the vessels still pulsing weakly, as if clinging to life. In this short moment, his mother, standing in the corridor, clasped her hands and whispered, "Go and save a human, so that my son continues to live somewhere on this earth." The heart was placed in cold preservative solution and hermetically sealed in a special container. All eyes followed it like the greatest treasure. A special convoy left immediately. Police cars with wailing sirens cleared the road, breaking the night silence of Vancouver. It was drizzling outside, headlight beams reflecting in long strips on the wet asphalt. Every minute counted, because the maximum cold ischemia time was about 10 hours, but the flight across the country was long. A minute's delay could ruin the whole operation. The container was delivered aboard a medical jet waiting at the airport. The plane door slammed shut. Engines roared. The heart left Vancouver, rushing into the night sky towards Toronto. In the cabin, the doctor accompanying the organ pressed the container tightly to himself, like a child, his eyes glued to the stopwatch. Every digit on the display echoed with tension. Meanwhile, in Toronto, Dr. Emily constantly checked Hans's condition. The monitor flashed alarming numbers, pulse falling then soaring, pressure unstable. He wheezed, "The heart, is it on the way?" Emily leaned down, her voice firm. "It is already flying. You must live until this moment." Hans closed his eyes. A distant bell ringing sounded in his head, as if trying to keep him conscious. He imagined the young heart rushing towards him, overcoming rain and wind through the long night over the prairies and lakes. In the air, the plane shook due to a small storm over the Rockies. The accompanying doctor squeezed the container even tighter, muttering to himself, "A little more. Hold on." The clock showed that 4 hours had passed. There was still enough ischemia time, but the reserve was relentlessly shrinking. When the plane landed at Pearson, it was just getting light. Fog covered the runway with a white veil. A convoy of ambulances was already waiting. The cabin door opened. The container was carried out like a shrine. Sirens wailed, and the convoy rushed towards downtown Toronto. The highway was relatively clear, cars parting ways. People on the shoulders looked with surprise as the cortege with blue and red flashers rushed through the mist. In the car, the doctor constantly reported the time via radio. 5 hours, 15 minutes passed. Still within normal limits. Continue to accelerate. In the hospital, Hans lay motionless, his lips blue. Dr. Emily stood by his bed, hand on the medical history, gaze sharp. She knew that if the heart arrived late, all efforts would be in vain. And then the rising howl of sirens sounded outside the gates. The convoy drove into the hospital courtyard. The container was delivered to the operating room. Dr. Emily took off her gloves, took a deep breath, and said to the whole team, "We begin. This is the final race." Hans was still breathing weakly. Outside, the morning sun of Toronto was rising, but in the operating room, the shadow of life and death still reigned. In a few moments, this Canadian heart would be in his chest, and this would be the moment that decided life or death. Operating room number 3 shone with the light of lamps. All instruments were laid out on shiny, cold stainless steel tables. Scalpels, clamps, needles, defibrillator, suction. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and tense silence, in which one could hear breathing through masks. The container was placed on the table. When the lid was opened, the pink heart appeared in the cold solution, looking like a red gem. Everyone in the room froze for a moment. Everyone knew that in this small muscle was the only chance to save a human. Dr. Emily pulled on gloves and nodded to the team. "We begin." The scalpel descended on Hans's chest. Skin and muscles were separated. The suction hummed evenly. When the chest cavity was opened, his old heart appeared under the light of lamps. It was dark in color and fluttered weakly, like a bird on the verge of death. Dr. Michael, the anesthesiologist, constantly reported indicators. Blood pressure 80/50, pulse intermittent. Need to increase vasopressors. The prolonged beep of the monitor tightened the atmosphere like a string. Hans was on the last edge. "Proceeding to remove the patient's heart," Dr. Emily pronounced decisively. Doctors quickly applied clamps and separated the old heart. When it was extracted from the chest, everyone fell silent. The chest cavity was empty. Only the steady hum of the heart-lung machine was heard. In this moment, Hans's life hung in the air. Dr. Emily took the new heart. She bent over it, not taking her eyes off the smallest blood vessels. Every movement in stitching was precise to the millimeter. The needle passed through the vessel walls. The blue thread tightened under the light of lamps like the finest silk. Time dragged painfully slowly. An hour, 2. Sweat ran down the doctor's forehead. A nurse constantly wiped her face, but Emily's hands never trembled. "Prepare the defibrillator," Emily said quietly when all sutures were placed. Electrodes were applied to the chest. The whole team held their breath. A dry beep sounded. Hans's chest jerked strongly, but only a cold straight line remained on the monitor. "Again," Emily's voice became firmer. Another discharge. The new heart contracted, but then froze again. Sweat appeared on everyone's foreheads. Ischemia time exceeded 7 hours. Not much remained. Last time, everyone focus, Emily almost growled, as if giving an order. Electrical discharge. 1. 2 seconds of tension. And suddenly one beat appeared on the screen. Then a second, third and shim. The new heart began to pulse evenly, gradually turning pink. The whole room exhaled with relief, as if climbing out of an abyss. Michael quickly reported, blood pressure 95/60, pulse stable. Dr. Emily's eyes flashed behind protective glasses. She nodded, her voice low but noticeably relieved. The heart is beating. We have a chance. In the corridor, the bells of a nearby church rang, their melodic chimes spreading through morning Toronto. Lying on the operating table, Hans did not know what was happening, but his soul seemed to hear this sound, as if an invisible hand pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. A Canadian heart began to beat in the chest of the German veteran, and the battle for life was still continuing. Hans was transferred to the intensive care unit. Yellow light fell on his pale face. His chest was bandaged. Dark red blood still oozed from drainage tubes. The ventilator made even clicks. The beep of the monitor echoed in his ears like a drum roll. Dr. Emily stood motionless by the bed, keeping her eyes on the screen. The new heart had only begun its journey in a foreign body. In the next 72 hours, any complication could end everything. At the 6th hour after surgery, Hans suddenly developed arrhythmia. The line on the ECG danced. A red alarm signal sounded throughout the ward. Dr. Michael immediately administered an anti-arrhythmic drug. The nurse adjusted the temporary pacemaker. Hans's body shook with convulsions. His face turned blue. Sweat rolled in large drops down the doctor's forehead. After almost 10 minutes of intense struggle, the heart rhythm gradually stabilized. At the 18th hour, the amount of blood from the drains increased. A risk of post-operative bleeding arose. Emily said quietly but firmly, "Be ready to return to the operating room if needed." The team urgently conducted an examination. Fortunately, the bleeding gradually decreased and did not reach a level requiring reopening the chest, but everyone understood that the slightest mistake, and Hans would die from blood loss. At the 30th hour, Dr. Emily noticed an increase in heart enzymes, a sign that the body was reacting to the foreign heart. Acute rejection could start at any moment. A high dose of immunosuppressants was immediately administered. Emily looked at Hans and mentally whispered, "You must fight with us. Do not give up." At the 50th hour, Hans showed a weak reaction. His eyelids fluttered. A hand moved under the blanket. The nurse quietly exclaimed, "He hears us." Dr. Michael leaned to his ear. "Wake up. You must survive to tell this story." At the 60th hour, Hans opened his eyes slightly, still in a semi-conscious state. He breathed heavily, lips moved, but there were no words. His hand slowly rose and lay on the bandaged chest. Tears rolled from the corners of his eyes. The young heart beat in him, with an unfamiliar but confident rhythm. At the 72nd hour, the whole ICU held its breath. The monitor showed a stable heart rhythm. Pressure held. Diuresis improved. Cold numbers now turned into music. Dr. Emily exhaled with relief. A rare, light smile appeared on her face after many days of tension. She turned to the team. "We passed through the gates of death, but the path to recovery is still long." Outside the window in Toronto, it was getting light. Yellow rays of sun fell on the green trees. In the ICU ward, Hans lay motionless, but his face had already turned pink, and with this steady heartbeat, he officially began a new life. A life saved by the heart of a young Canadian guy. After 3 days, which seemed like eternity, some calm finally reigned in the intensive care unit. The monitor beeped evenly, the heart rhythm displayed clearly. There were no more chaotic jumps or red alarm signals. Hans lay motionless. His face was exhausted, but a blush had already appeared. The nurse changed the IV drip and said quietly, "Pulse is stable. He may wake up at any moment." On that day, when the pale sun broke through the window pane, Hans's eyelids fluttered. He opened his eyes and stared at the white ceiling. All sounds around burst into his consciousness. The noise of the ventilator, hurried steps, and especially the steady beep of the monitor, like a new melody. He touched his chest with a trembling hand. Under the thick layer of bandages, the young heart beat strongly, quite unlike his own old, worn-out one. Tears welled up in his eyes. At that moment, he realized that a part of a Canadian boy's body lived in him. Dr. Emily approached, her voice soft but confident. "You survived the crisis. The new heart is working well." Hans tried to say something, but his voice was hoarse. "This is a Canadian heart." Emily nodded. In her eyes was not only the pride of a doctor, but something more. This heart no longer belonged to one person. It became a bridge connecting two destinies, two nations separated by ocean and history. Hans closed his eyes. 2 tears rolled down his cheeks. He whispered, his voice breaking. "Once I was a soldier in a foreign land. Now I have returned with your heart. God chose a strange way to forgive me." Outside the window, the ringing of church bells came from afar. This sound mixed with the beating of the heart in his chest, echoing like music of rebirth. David, the coordinator, stood nearby and was silent. He looked at the German with mixed feelings: compassion, admiration, and belief that sometimes fate knows how to heal the deepest wounds. That evening, when the ward became quiet, Hans quietly called for a translator to help communicate fully. He wheezed, "I want to meet the family of the person who gave me his heart. Give me the opportunity to say thank you." These words, trembling but weighty, hung in the air. This was not just gratitude for life, but also an apology of a veteran before a country he had once viewed as a distant stranger. The Canadian heart in his chest beat, every beat reminding he was given a second chance, and this chance was given not only to live, but to redeem. A week after the operation, when his condition stabilized, Dr. Emily entered the ward. She sat by Hans's bed, her voice low but warm. "One person wants to meet with you. It is the mother of the young man who donated his heart to you. Are you strong enough?" Hans shuddered. His hand squeezed the edge of the blanket, eyes filled with tears. He nodded weakly. The door opened and a Canadian woman entered. She wore a simple dark dress, face exhausted, eyes swollen from tears, hair disheveled. But in her gaze was a strange calmness. She looked at Hans silently for a long time. For her, he was a stranger, a German, from a distant land with a difficult history. But exactly this person now lived thanks to her son's heart. For several minutes, no one said a word. The silence was oppressive. Then Hans tried to sit up, put his hand on his chest. His voice trembled. "This heart belongs to your son. I do not know what to say, except thank you. And forgive me." The woman shuddered. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She approached closer and looked him straight in the eyes. "My son is gone, but he always wanted to live with dignity. If his heart beats in your chest, I only ask you, live for him too." Hans sobbed. He reached out with a trembling hand to her calloused hand. The hand of a mother who lost a son now lay on the chest of a German veteran who many years ago carried a weapon. In this moment, borders, history, distance, everything disappeared. Only 2 people remained, a mother who lost a child and a father who lost his soul in the past, who now shared one heartbeat. Dr. Emily stood in the corner of the room. She knew she was witnessing something that went beyond medicine. It was a moment when heart without borders became reality. The Canadian woman added quietly, her voice breaking, "Consider that now you carry a part of my family in you. Live well. Only then will I know that my son is still somewhere on this earth." Hans bowed his head, tears flowing ceaselessly. He whispered, "I promise. Every beat of this heart will be gratitude." Outside the window, the sun of Toronto flooded the trees with gold. In the small ward, 2 destinies from different worlds met and found a strange forgiveness. After almost 2 weeks in intensive care, Hans was transferred to a regular ward. He was still thin, skin pale, but a blush appeared on his lips. The new heart beat evenly and strongly, affirming reborn life. In the morning, sunlight poured through the window onto his bed. The nurse helped Hans sit up. For the first time in many years, he breathed without heavy wheezing, without attacks of pain in the chest that forced him to fall. Dr. Emily entered with a rare smile. "Shall we try to stand up a little?" Hans nodded weakly. He grabbed the walker, legs trembling. Knees seemed unable to hold his body. Sweat poured in streams, chest tightened. But when the heart in his chest beat stronger, he realized he was alive. 1 step, then a second. The whole ward exploded with joyful cheers. Hans stopped, breathing heavily, but a smile appeared on his lips. He put a trembling hand on his chest. "This boy is helping me walk." With each day, Hans walked further. From a few steps around the ward to a short walk along the corridor, and then around the hospital grounds. He listened with surprise to the singing of birds in the trees, saw small wildflowers growing by the wall. These sounds and images seemed mundane, but for him, they were a true miracle. One evening, when the crimson sun was setting behind the skyscrapers, Hans sat on a bench in the hospital garden next to Dr. Emily. He said quietly, "Once I walked the earth in military boots. Today I walk again, but with the heart of a Canadian man." 2 returns, but their meaning is so different that I myself cannot believe it. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked into the distance, where other patients were making their first steps, where relatives laughed and encouraged each other. Then she said quietly, "There are wounds that only time and mercy can heal. You are given a second chance. Live with dignity." Hans was silent, his eyes moist. He understood that these first steps were not just physical recovery, but also first steps on the path to reconciliation with himself, with the world that had haunted him all his life. That night, returning to the ward, Hans lay on his back, putting his hand on his chest. The young heart beat confidently. He whispered quietly in the darkness, "Thank you. I will live so as not to disgrace this heartbeat." A month after the transplant, Hans's health stabilized. He could already walk short distances without a walker. Dr. Emily insisted on additional rest, but Hans begged, "I must go to one place, a place of memory. Otherwise, I will never be able to truly live on." In the end, Emily agreed, but on condition that he would be accompanied by a doctor and a nurse. The car drove out of Toronto, past green hills and rivers spreading under the sun. Hans sat by the window, his heart overflowing with feelings. Every landscape was like a slice of new life. When he reached the War Memorial Park, Hans froze. The ground, dedicated to memory, was covered with even rows of stones. But in his eyes stood the mist of his own memories. Fallen soldiers, craters from explosions, cries of children from his past. Hans walked slowly, the heart in his chest beating evenly. Every beat was like a hammer hitting memory, reminding that now he lived not only for himself, but for the Canadian guy who gave him his heart. He approached the memorial where thousands of names were carved in granite. Hans bowed and laid a white carnation, his trembling hand touching the cold stone. He whispered, "I was a stranger. Forgive me. Now the heart of your country, the heart of one of yours, supports life in me. Every beat is gratitude and repentance." Tears rolled down his exhausted face. For the first time in his life, Hans felt relief. The burden he had carried for decades seemed to leave with the tears falling on the grass. Emily stood behind and watched silently. She understood that this journey was not just an operation, but a healing of the soul. In the evening, Hans stopped by a small church near the city. The bell ringing spread in the evening wind, solemn and gentle. He closed his eyes, pressing his hand to his chest. The new heartbeat merged with the ringing of bells, creating a strange melody. In this moment, he realized that he found reconciliation not only with the world, but with himself, with his youth lost in smoke and flames. In the autumn of that year, an international medical conference was held in Toronto. Cardiologists from all over the world gathered to discuss the latest achievements. In the program was one item that caused special interest. Story of a special patient, German veteran, living with a Canadian heart. The hall shone with light. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the stage. When Hans appeared, thin but with a clear gaze, silence reigned in the hall. He wore a simple shirt, under the fabric of which a long scar could be guessed. He slowly approached the podium, put his hand on his chest. The microphone trembled slightly from his hoarse voice. "My name is Hans Müller. Almost half a century ago, I carried a weapon. In that time, I saw sorrow. But this time, I returned with the heart of a Canadian man." The whole hall froze. He paused, his eyes filled with tears, and then continued. "Then I saw only division. Today, I see mercy. The heart that beats in my chest once beat in the chest of a 23-year-old Canadian guy. His family gave it to me when he left. Canadian doctors stitched every vessel, every thread, so that I would live. If you ask if a miracle exists, here is the proof." Applause broke out, but Hans raised his hand, asking for silence. He continued with a firm voice. "Medicine has no borders. Mercy has no nationality. I, a man who came from far away, now live thanks to the heart of the people here. This reminds me and all of us, the past may be full of pain, but the future must be built on forgiveness and humanity." The hall exploded with ovations that did not cease. Many doctors, scientists, and even other veterans present at the conference stood up, wiping tears. Dr. Emily sat in the first row, her eyes shining. She knew that this moment was bigger than just a successful operation. It was proof of the power of medicine and mercy, capable of rewriting a chapter in history. Hans bowed his head, putting his hand on his chest, and finished with a promise. "Every beat of my heart will be a tribute of respect to Canada, to the donor's family, and those people in white coats who brought me back from the other world." Applause sounded again, loud, full of admiration. In this moment, the Canadian heartbeat not only in Hans's chest, but echoed in the hearts of everyone who was in this hall. A year after the successful transplant, Hans returned to Canada again. This time there was no wailing of ambulance sirens, no blinding light of operating lamps. He returned with a confident gait, deep and even breathing, the young heart in his chest beating at full strength. A small car took him along the road to the memorial. It was a sunny March day, fields stretching like a green carpet. Hans looked out the window, remembering how he first stepped on this land in desperate need. The same road, but now filled with peace. Here were only the chirping of birds and the laughter of children running near the woods. He carried a bouquet of white flowers in his hands. His goal was that same memorial cemetery where soldiers rested, the place where he had once stood, carrying the guilt of a survivor. Hans sank to his knees and placed the flowers at the monument. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling every heartbeat, and whispered, "Once I felt like an enemy of peace. Today I returned with the heart of a son of this land. Allow me to reconcile. Allow me to live the rest of my life as a grateful man." The wind from the fields ran through the grass, and it bowed as if in answer. The next day he met with the donor's mother again. She took him by the hand and smiled softly. "You are healthy. I am glad that his heart beats well in you. Live for him too." Hans nodded with tears in his eyes. In this moment, he felt that he found a family in a country that was once just a distant dot on a map. The trip ended in Toronto. In the evening, Hans sat on the waterfront of Lake Ontario, admiring the Cannes Tower shining in lights. He listened to the beating of the heart in his chest, which merged with the distant ringing of church bells. These sounds wove into music of forgiveness, into a melody of a closed circle that lasted almost half a century. Hans closed his eyes and smiled. He knew he would not live forever, but this heart would beat until his last breath, as proof that the past can be healed and humanity can overcome any distance. In the quiet Canadian night, the German veteran listened to how a Canadian heart beat in his chest. This beating not only supported life in him, but also preserved the history of reconciliation in the memory of both nations.